especially with regards to climate change, but this is in many areas of life, of course, where you have the feeling that nothing you do makes a difference. Where it's pointless. Where you think it's your fault or it's that person's fault or it'll never change. Right? Humanity should just go away. We've destroyed everything. It's the only solution. Yeah. I know I have moments where I think things like that. I have times where I just want to give up or I don't even want to start because I don't know how or what. When the overwhelm of the amount of plastic I have to bring home with me when I go grocery shopping is more than I can actually handle. And so I just shut off. What are the times where you do that? Where you check out or shut off or give up? Just notice. And the opposite, of course, is equally true, or the pair is equally true. When are the times where you feel empowered, ignited, invited, full of hope, full of elan, full of action? Moments or times or places where you feel really engaged and where everything is possible. What does that feel like in your body? What does that feel like in your heart? So the key with learned helplessness is the belief that that we cannot control, we cannot influence, we cannot make a difference in our environment or in the world around us. And after repeated experiences of that, we just give up. I want to name that, the kind of humanness of this and the normalness of it and that this is a way that a healthy psyche, that a psyche responds um, as a protective strategy, right? So here I want to normalize this because I want to kind of unpack or release or together sort of open up the shame straitjacket that gets packed around these feelings. That it means we're bad people or that it means something about us. It just means we're human in this terrible situation, doing the best we can. Yeah. So the good news is um, the two things that help learned helplessness the most, heal learned helplessness the most are feeling our feelings, whatever they are: grief, joy, rage, gratitude, and then togetherness, community. Right? So here we are doing exactly that. we're saying yes to both of those things in this time together. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to rattle and sing us over the threshold of this time into once upon a time. And then I'll begin the story of the handless maiden. Once there was a miller and his family. And this mill had been in the family for generations past, from father to son. And it had always done very well. village grew to a town. More and more people moved there, and the families grew because the town was so prosperous. More and more forests were cut down to make way for fields, for grain, for the people's bread. And they all brought their grain to the miller. But this is not the story of the miller's success. It is the story of what happened when the miller could no longer be a miller. For you see, there was a great drought in the land. There wasn't enough rain to grow the crops, and people started to import grain from the neighboring kingdom. And it was already milled there, and came to the town and the market stalls as flour. And so the miller suddenly had no work anymore. And once the people started importing flour from the neighboring kingdom, they so enjoyed the fact that they didn't have to do the back-breaking work of growing their own grain anymore that they never went back. And so the miller was only a miller in name, Mr. Miller and Mrs. Miller, but they no longer had a functioning mill. And so they grew poorer. And they too had to buy their flour at the market from the neighboring kingdom, rather than receiving a tithed portion from the grains that they milled at the mill. And so Mr. Miller became a woodcutter. With his last little bit of money, he bought himself a silver-lipped axe, and he would go out into the forests, which were farther away from the town than they had been in his youth, to cut down trees and to bring firewood back, or to bring wood back for the folks who would make benches and beds and cupboards. Or for the ranchers to build fences to keep in their sheep or their cattle. And the miller was an okay woodcutter, but it was not a very cushy existence. And he missed the days of his prime when the mill was running and they were wealthy. And so he began to kind of mutter under his breath, it was so much better in the old days. This stupid axe. Actually, I don't even like cutting wood. Ugh. And he began to resent life, really. But he saw no other way than for the rest of his days to go into the forest and cut wood. He was bored and unhappy and frustrated and hungry, and he needed a new pair of shoes. He almost could walk better backwards than forwards because his heels had worn down so much. And so one day, as he was walking farther and farther into the forest that he'd never been before because he'd already cut down the trees that he could cut down, and he was selecting a tree to cut when a strange man in a frock coat and shiny shoes, really gorgeous shoes, walked up to him. He'd been in the middle of grumbling, and he'd been sort of not really paying attention because he'd been focusing on the tree that he was going to be cutting down. And so he forgot to be rather surprised that another human was out in the woods with him. And it didn't really occur to him to be surprised that he was wearing clothing from, a generation ago. He had really nice shoes, shiny, beautiful heels. That was pretty much all he could see and covet. "Hello," said the gentleman with the shiny shoes. "Hello. I know who you are," he said to Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller just looked at him, not knowing who he was. And as he took a breath to say something about the fact that it actually was strange to meet another human out this far in the woods, the gentleman in the frock coat with the shiny shoes said to him, "And I know what you need and what you want." And he looked down at the miller's very scuffy, heelless shoes with a kind of a smirk. Mr. Miller was rather embarrassed about the state of his shoes and shifted his weight from one leg to the other and sort of looked down and away. And so he didn't notice many things about the gentleman, the slick gentleman in the shiny shoes. "And I will give you everything your heart desires. New shoes, new clothes, food, animals, servants, a beautiful house, a cook. Everything your heart desires, I will give you. Everything you had once, and even more. And all you have to give me is what's standing behind your mill." The miller thought for a moment. "All I have to do is give you what's standing behind my mill. What is standing behind my mill?" He thought feverishly, and all he could come up with was the apple tree. He could plant another apple tree. "Okay, let's make a deal." And he stuck out his hand and shook hands with the gentleman in the frock coat and the shiny shoes. Oh, they were such beautiful shoes. He couldn't really stop looking at them and smirking and smiling to himself gleefully that he too soon would have such beautiful shoes, and he would have everything back. Everything how it was once, and more. And so he went home quickly, leaving the wood behind him with his silver-lipped axe over his shoulders, and he ran back through the forest home. And coming from the mill, running into the forest, was his wife. "Husband! Husband! What is going on? The house has suddenly gotten bigger, and there's people in it, and they're cleaning, and their cupboards are full of food, and look at my clothes. She was dressed in a beautiful waistcoat and a beautiful dress. And he couldn't really see her feet because of her skirts being so long, but he knew that she had beautiful shoes on. What happened? Oh, said Mr. Miller. Well, I was out in the forest, as I am, and chopping down a tree, as I do, and, well, this man showed up in a frock coat with really beautiful shoes. His wife got very skeptical very quickly. And what, pray tell, did you have to do? What did he say to you? Well, I don't really know, really, except for he said that he'd make everything like it used to be, and all I had to do was give him what was behind the mill, and I thought, well, we could plant another apple tree, it's no problem. How could you be so stupid? Behind the mill, the whole morning long, was our daughter sweeping the yard. You have traded our daughter for riches. Mr. Miller didn't want to believe what his wife had just said. It couldn't possibly be. It couldn't be true. He would never do that. He didn't do that. That's not what he meant to do. He would never, ever do that. It couldn't possibly be true. And they went home together. And as soon as Mr. Miller stepped onto his property, he too was suddenly wearing a beautiful waistcoat and beautiful pants and beautiful shiny shoes. But he didn't really notice them because his daughter came running into his arms to greet him when he returned. And still telling himself that it couldn't possibly be true, he held her more tightly than he maybe should have and wept. What, Papa? She said. Why are you holding me so tight? Let me go. Are you crying? Why are you crying, Papa? Look, everything's like it was, and even better. It's amazing. Did you see? There's horses in the stable. We never had horses. Mr. Miller went running around, looking in the cupboards, seeing all of the people suddenly in his house, cleaning and cooking, and in his stables with horses, and there were sheep, and people caring for them. And everything had been made new, and the house was twice as big as it was before. He was amazed. He had a sneaking suspicion with whom he had made a deal, but he really didn't want that to be true either, and so instead he just ran around very excitedly looking at everything and squealing like a small child. One moon later. For the man in the frock coat with the shiny shoes had said he would come in a month's time to retrieve what was his. Mr. Miller knew that he was not to cut the apple tree down, but rather to give his daughter away as a bride. And as the day arrived, closer and closer, he finally told her what he had done. He was so ashamed he couldn't look her in the eyes. And again he shifted from foot to foot and looked down and away and mumbled out of the corner of his mouth, "Well, actually, we only have all of these riches because I said that the man could have what was behind the house, and I didn't know that you were sweeping. I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to. I really didn't mean to." And his daughter, grasping the full horror of the situation, took it really well in stride, actually, and began to prepare. Her mother had been sewing her a dress, which she hadn't known about. And so the morning of the day that the man in the frock coat would come, she washed herself and put the dress on. And she went out to the yard, to the same place where she had been sweeping that fateful day. And she drew a circle in the sand, in the dirt around her, like her grandmother had taught her. And she stood within the circle to wait. Dusk came upon them all, and with the setting of the sun, there the elegant man in the frock coat with the shiny shoes appeared. And when she looked at him, her heart grew cold, and she was clutched with fear. He came closer and ever closer. She didn't know what would happen, but she stood still in her circle, praying that it would be over quickly, whatever it was. But when he reached the edge of the circle, he could not cross it. He made a kind of grunt, and she looked up, and he couldn't move. He couldn't step over the circle. And the man in the elegant frock coat, his face turned into a snarl of rage. "You will not wash, and you will draw no circles in the sand. I will be back in 1 moon's time." And he disappeared, and she didn't wash, and her nails grew long, and her hair grew straggly, and the white dress grew dirty gray, and her feet grew brown. And a month later, the day came, and again she stood in the yard, didn't make a circle, but stood there, waiting. She knew now who was coming, and she wasn't less terrified, but she was in her own decision, her own yes, to meet whatever was coming at her. But when the elegantly dressed man in the frock coat and the shiny shoes appeared, and she looked at him, again her heart was gripped with ice and terror, and she began to weep. And as he moved closer and closer to her, her terror grew more and more, and her tears flowed down her arms and down her face. And he could not touch her. He could not come close to her. And the man in the frock coat, again with the face of a snarl of rage, turned to her father and said, "Cut off her hands!" And the father did nothing. but stood there, frozen. Her hands are clean from her tears. You must cut them off or I cannot touch her. And again. And still, the father just stood there. And the man in the beautiful frock coat said to him, if you do not do this thing, I will destroy everything as far as you can see in every direction. The entire town will be razed. The fields will burn and the animals will die and the people will suffer and it will be your fault. Mr. Miller stood there, and his daughter, who understood what was happening, went into the tool shed and got her father's silver-lipped axe and brought it over to him and handed it to him and said, it's okay, Papa. And she went over to the chopping block where her father cut the wood with his silver-lipped axe and laid her hands on the chopping block. And her father looked at his daughter, and tears rolled down his face. And slowly he walked over to her. And he arrived at the chopping block, and she looked up at him, weeping, but calm. Yes, to her future and whatever fate would bring. And her father lifted his axe and swung it down, severing his daughter's hand from her arms. And then many things happened all at once. The mother, shrieking and screaming, came running out of the house with bandages and cloths to staunch the blood. The father vomited from horror and nausea and threw his axe on the ground. The hands lay there on the chopping block, and everyone ignored them, except for the man in the frock coat. He said, I'll be back in a month. And 1 moon later, her wounds had healed enough that she could walk about bandaged and participate, learning how to deal with 2 stumps instead of hands, how to feed herself, how to dress herself. She still wasn't able to wash, and so the day came once again at the end of the moon time, and she stood in the yard waiting with a very different energy. She just didn't care. She had already been through hell. There was not really anything that this devil could do to her, more than he'd already done. And so she stood there in her most powerful place, in her most inner full place, and dared the man in the frock coat to come. And come he did. And when she saw him, again her heart grew cold, and again she began to weep. These were no longer tears of helplessness and victimhood. These were the cleansing and empowering tears of rage. And they washed her face clean, and they washed her body clean, and they made her untouchable forever by the man in the frock coat and the shiny shoes. She told her parents she would not stay with them, and that they should bind her hands, her stumps, fresh, give her something to eat, some bread and some cheese to take with her, and that she would go out into the world and depend upon the kindness of strangers. And so she left home and went into the forest and drank from the river like a deer and ate berries directly from the vines and ate her bread and lived in the forest and dreamt and spoke with no humans and slept in no bed for 3 months. And as the days and nights began to grow colder, the king from that neighboring kingdom where they grew the grain and delivered the flour was riding through the forest that was on the border between the two kingdoms on a hunting party. And she was sitting with her back against an oak tree, watching the way the sunlight moved in the leaves and listening to the rustle of their dance with one another, the wind and the leaves. Her eyes were closed. And the king saw her and thought that she was the most exquisite creature he had ever seen. And so he went over to her and asked her what her name was, and where she was from, and what she was doing in the forest, and if she might like to come and live in the castle. Well, she was a sensible girl and knew that winter was coming on, and so she said yes. And so at the end of the day, the king and she rode together on a horse back to the castle with the rest of the hunting party. And then the real magic started. You see, they would go for walks in the gardens. And sometimes they would slip over the garden wall and out into the forest where they were both much happier and spend hours talking. She never spoke about what happened and why she only had stumps where there used to be hands. But the king made her a pair of silver hands. Or had them made. And they, meanwhile, fell in love. And through the winter, they dreamed together. They made love together. They discovered the secret heart of one another. And in the spring, they were married. But their joy did not last very long, for a few months later, war broke out in yet another kingdom, and the king had to leave to go to war. And he said to his mother, "Take good care of my bride. She's pregnant. Tell me as soon as the baby comes." And so the months went by as they do. The king was at war and would send messages home every once in a while. Letters, love letters to his beloved. And as the time drew close, all preparations were made for the birth of the child that the queen carried in her belly. And the king's mother was a lovely and loving, tender of her stepdaughter. There was also a love and a kindness between them. And the queen brought a healthy and beautiful girl into the world. And so the mother wrote a letter and gave it to a messenger who took off in the direction of the neighboring kingdom, some days away. And you see, between the king's kingdom and the kingdom with whom they were at war, there was a great river, and that river had to be crossed by a ferry. And the messenger would arrive at the river after having traveled for 3 days and 3 nights. And he would get so tired. And he just had to lay down a little bit and take a rest because he was so tired. And while he was sleeping, a very elegantly dressed man in a frock coat with shiny shoes came to him and slipped the letter from the king's mother that she had written to the king out of his saddlebag and put a letter of his own into it. And when he disappeared, the messenger suddenly woke up. Funny that. And he was refreshed, and he could continue and carry on as if nothing had happened. And so he went over the ferry, over the river, and continued on another 3 days and 3 nights until he arrived at the king's camp. And the king, joyful that a letter had returned, knowing that his wife's time must be near, and very nervous to hear about her condition and who had been born, if it was a girl or boy, and that everything was all right, he opened up the letter and excitedly read, and it said, "The queen has given birth to a monster, half human and half dog." Oh, my poor beloved. She must be so distraught. And so he wrote a letter back with as much love and support and kindness as he could possibly muster, and sent it back with the messenger, who rode 3 days and 3 nights to the river. And just when he got to the river, he just got so sleepy that he just had to get off his horse and lay down and sleep for a while. And lo and behold, a man elegantly dressed in a frock coat with very shiny shoes took the letter out of the saddlebag and put one of his own inside. And as soon as he had done that, the messenger woke full of energy, got on the ferry, and rode back to the castle, delivering the letter to the king's mother. "Watch the queen carefully and take care of the child, but do not let it out of your sight. It is a thing, and we must figure out how to deal with it." Well, the king's mother was quite shocked about the tone of the letter, and so she wrote back, and the letters went back and forth each time, and each time the messenger grew sleepy at the river, and each time the man with the frock coat and the shiny shoes slipped the letter out that had been written and put one of his own into the saddlebags, until the very last letter came from the king in the messenger's hand, running over to the castle. "Kill the queen and save her tongue and heart as proof." The king's mother wouldn't do it. And so she bound the baby to her breast so that the baby could eat, gave her food to eat along the way, and sent her out into the forest. She knew the forest well because she and her son had spent many hours there together. And so she sent her into the forest and had a deer killed instead, keeping the tongue and the heart as proof in a box. Some few months later, the king returned victorious from the war, joyful and full of excitement and longing to see his beloved and meet his daughter. And he came running into the castle, but they were nowhere to be found. He expected her to be there, waiting for him, but he couldn't find her anywhere. He went searching through the entire castle, asking everybody who worked there if they had seen his beloved. But they, of course, had sworn to the king's mother they would say nothing. And so, finally, in the throne room, where she was sitting regent on the throne for her son until he returned, sat the mother of the king, with a stern look in her eye and no love for her son. But no one but a monster could demand such a thing of her. And between them, on a little table, stood a box, and in that box, which she opened, was a heart and a tongue, a few months old. "Well," she said, "I have done as you asked. There is your tongue and the heart of the woman you called beloved." But the king knew nothing of this, and he burst into tears, and he threw himself on the floor, and he wept, and he tore his clothes, and he tore his hair, and he wailed. And when he had wept so that a puddle of water was around him on the floor, he looked at his mother, who had wept with him because she understood that he had no idea. And she came running to him and she said, "No, no, son, no." And she took him in her arms and she said, "No, it's the heart and the tongue of a deer, my love. It's the heart and tongue of a deer. They are well. I bundled your baby to the breast of your beloved and sent them out into the forest that you know and love so well. They must still be alive." And so the king, vowing to neither eat nor wash nor sleep in any human dwelling, left on foot for the forest and began to search. He searched, and his hair grew and became dreadlocked, and his beard grew and became matted, and birds made nests in his hair, and mice moved into his beard, and lice were all over the place that the birds and the mice could eat, and his clothing was torn and ragged, and still he continued wandering, year in and year out, for his beloved. Meanwhile, she, in the forest, had found a little cottage where two old people lived, ancient ones, so wrinkled there was more wrinkle than skin left on them. In beautiful woven green dyed clothing, they looked part plant and part stone and part human. Must have been part forest spirit as well. And they took the queen and her child, her daughter, into their home, and they cared for them. And the real magic began. For as she lived in this house, and she learned about the plants of the forest and the animals of the forest, and she spent time with these two ancient ones and ate their food and listened to their stories and their ways and learned with them, little by little baby hands began to grow out of the stumps of her arms. And as the years went by, the little baby hands turned into girls' hands. And she learned the ways of the forest people, of these ancient ones. She learned to gather plants, and she learned to harvest, and she learned to tend and care, and she learned to make offerings of beauty. And her hands grew from child's hands to woman's hands. 7 long years she spent at the cottage. 7 years her daughter grew, also learning these ways. And 7 long years the king searched. But at the end of the 7 years, the magic of the cottage began to call to him, and so he found it, although he was sure he'd been there many times already in the last 7 years, and surely he would have seen the cottage, but suddenly it appeared before him. And though he had vowed to enter no human buildings and to eat no human food, still he was drawn, and he went and knocked on the door of the cottage, and the 2 ancient ones answered, laughing. And they pulled him in, and they trimmed his beard and his hair, washed him, and gave him clothes to put on. And he wept. He wept at the tenderness and the touch of humans after such a long time. And he wept at the taste of this food of the forest cooked by these 2 ancient ones, after not having eaten any cooked food, any food, in so long. And he wept at the longing and the grief and the missing his beloved and his daughter, when suddenly he heard the laughter of a child. He looked at the ancient ones, and they began to laugh. And he dared to hope, except he couldn't hope. It couldn't possibly be true. He dared to hope, but he couldn't hope. And they just looked at the door over in the corner, giggling. And he went over and knocked. "Come in." And as he opened the door, he saw indeed a woman and a young girl who could definitely be about 7. And the woman was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She indeed looked very much like his beloved, and when they looked into each other's eyes, their hearts sang and melted and danced and leapt all at the same time. And then the king looked down and saw the hands of the woman. And his heart broke at all the hope that had filled him at having found her at last left him. And again he wept. And he was about to leave the room when the woman said to him, "Dearest, where are you going? You found me." And he said, "No, it can't be. You see, my beloved has no hands. And you, as beautiful as you are, you have hands." And in answer, she stood and went over to a trunk and opened it and brought out a bundle and walked over to him and kissed him on the cheek as she placed the bundle in his hands. And he opened it, and there lay the silver hands that had been made for her, that he had gifted her. And he began to laugh. He began to laugh with joy. And they fell into each other's arms, laughing and kissing and crying, holding each other tightly, kissing each other, and scooping their little girl up into their arms to be with them in the embrace. And the 2 ancient ones came, laughing and pulling them out of the cottage and sending them on their way back to the castle. And the mother of the king, who had been waiting in the castle for 7 years, praying that imagine her joy when all three walked in the door. And there was a second wedding, and a celebration that went on for days, and more children. And the two of them were the kindest, king and queen. And like they, having been renewed, brought renewal to the land. I know because one of the people who worked in the kitchens was my great granddaughter. To come alive a second. To come alive a second time, you have to be ready to imagine what you now cannot imagine. To come alive a second time, you have to be ready to imagine what you now cannot imagine. You have to be willing to risk what you now are unwilling to risk. You must hang out with the enchantresses, with your own reckless dreams and other daring and damned folk who urge you relentlessly to the furthest ever expanding edge of creation. In that fantastic place, you may become again wise in the ways of the sea, skilled in navigating the empty, heaving immensities. Having fallen as you will, as you must, in love, at long last with your own animal spirits and the desperate gods that inspire them. To come alive a second time, you have to be ready to imagine what you now cannot imagine. You have to be willing to risk what you now are unwilling to risk. You must hang out with the enchantresses, with your own reckless dreams and other daring and damned folk who urge you relentlessly to the furthest ever expanding edge of creation. In that fantastic place, you may become again wise in the ways of the sea, skilled in navigating the empty, heaving immensities. Having fallen, as you will, as you must, in love at long last, with your own animal spirits and the desperate gods that inspire them. To Come Alive a Second by Stephen Hyde.